On the morning when the sun rose over those emerald waters of the South Pacific on the 18th day of April in 1943, nobody among the Imperial Japanese Navy's elite fighter pilots preparing their aircraft at Rabaul could have imagined that within less than 20 minutes the entire course of the Pacific War would shift in a way that could never be undone. 6 men, each one a veteran of some of the most brutal aerial combat the world had ever seen, were about to become footnotes in a tragedy that would haunt Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the conflict and beyond. These weren't just any pilots thrown together for a routine escort mission. Every single one had been selected with meticulous care, chosen specifically because they had proven themselves in the unforgiving skies over Guadalcanal, where American and Japanese fighters had been tearing each other apart for months. They were survivors in the truest sense, men who had faced death dozens of times and somehow kept returning to base when so many others had not. Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Morisaki stood among them as the flight leader, a position he had earned through demonstrated competence in combat. Alongside him was Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka, whose tactical instincts had kept him breathing through engagements that should have killed him. Then there was Petty Officer First Class Shoichi Sugita, a genuine ace with roughly 20 confirmed victories already marked against his name, the kind of pilot other men looked to when things got desperate. Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya had built a reputation as an exceptional marksman, credited with 8 kills and known for his ability to make shots that others couldn't even attempt. Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsujinue brought steady nerves to the group, the sort of calm reliability that proved invaluable when everything went sideways in the middle of a dogfight. The youngest of them, Petty Officer Second Class Yasushi Okazaki, had already proven himself worthy of flying alongside these veterans despite his relative youth. When Commander Tadashi Nakajima of the 204th Air Group assembled these 6 pilots for their briefing, the weight of what they were being told settled over them like a physical presence. The following day, they would escort Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself during an inspection tour to Bougainville. This wasn't just another mission protecting bombers on a strike against American positions. This was the supreme honor, the kind of assignment that defined a military career. Yamamoto wasn't simply another admiral barking orders from a battleship somewhere safe behind the lines. He was the mind behind Japan's entire naval strategy, the architect who had conceived and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor, perhaps the only leader in the entire Imperial Japanese military establishment who truly grasped both the possibilities and the limitations Japan faced in this war against America's industrial might. The pilots understood immediately that they had been entrusted with protecting something far more valuable than any ship or airfield could ever be. What these men preparing their fighters at Rabaul had no way of knowing was that 1,600 miles away at Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts had just pulled off one of the most significant intelligence breakthroughs of the entire war. 4 days earlier, on April 14th, multiple American radio intercept stations had picked up a Japanese naval message designated NTF-131755, encoded in something called the JN-25D cipher. American codebreakers had been steadily unraveling this cipher system since before the Battle of Midway, and by April of 1943 they could read Japanese naval communications almost as easily as the intended recipients. The message that came through that day was addressed to the commanders of Base Unit No. 1, the 11th Air Flotilla, and the 26th Air Flotilla. What made it extraordinary was its content. The Japanese, with their notorious obsession for precise planning and punctuality, had transmitted a complete and detailed itinerary of Admiral Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour. Not just the general plan, but exact departure times, precise arrival schedules, and the specific routing the Admiral's aircraft would follow. The decrypt revealed Yamamoto's schedule with such minute precision that the American intelligence officers who first read it could hardly believe what they were seeing. The Japanese had essentially provided a perfect blueprint for an assassination, handed it over in a format the Americans could read, and done so with such confidence in their code security that they apparently never considered the possibility that enemy cryptanalysts might be reading their most secret communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself had to make the call on what happened next, and after consultations with Washington that went all the way to the top, the decision came back. Yamamoto had to be eliminated. The man was simply too valuable to the Japanese war effort, too brilliant a strategist, too effective a leader. If there was a chance to remove him from the board, that chance had to be taken. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the planning for what they would call Operation Vengeance began with some hard mathematical realities that couldn't be ignored. The distance from Guadalcanal to the interception point near Bougainville measured out at 420 miles, which sat right at the absolute limit of what a P-38 Lightning fighter could manage on a combat mission. Achieving that range would require auxiliary fuel tanks, perfect navigation, and basically everything going right. Major John Mitchell, commanding the 339th Fighter Squadron, spent the night of April 17th working through calculations with his operations staff, figuring fuel consumption rates, wind speeds, and the precise timing required to intercept Yamamoto's flight at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place. The plan that emerged from those calculations was audacious in its precision. 18 P-38s would be assigned to the mission, though as it turned out, only 16 would actually fly after 2 aircraft developed mechanical problems during startup. Those 16 P-38s would follow a carefully calculated route that kept them beyond the range of Japanese radar installations and coast watchers, maintaining complete radio silence the entire way and flying at wave-top height to avoid any possibility of detection. The flight path consisted of 5 separate legs, each one timed with precision. Any deviation from the plan, any mechanical failure, any navigational error would result in mission failure. The intercept was calculated for 0935 hours, which would give the Americans exactly 15 minutes of combat time before fuel considerations forced them to turn for home. Miss that window, and the whole thing would be for nothing. The 6 Zero pilots preparing their A6M-3 Model 22 fighters at Rabaul represented what should have been the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation. The Zero had been revolutionary when it first appeared, a synthesis of range, maneuverability, and firepower that seemed almost impossible given the limitations of carrier-based fighter design. The aircraft achieved its remarkable performance through radical weight reduction, with every single component scrutinized for excess weight that could be eliminated. The designers had stripped away armor protection for the pilot, deleted self-sealing fuel tanks that would have added weight, and built the airframe to the absolute minimum strength requirements. What resulted was a fighter that could outturn anything else in the sky and operate at ranges that seemed impossible for other carrier-based fighters to match. But by April of 1943, that revolutionary design philosophy had become a liability. The A6M3 variant these pilots would fly the next morning had attempted to address some of the Zero's weaknesses. It featured a more powerful Sakai 21 engine producing 1130 horsepower, offered improved high-altitude performance, and could dive somewhat faster than earlier models. But the fundamental vulnerabilities remained unchanged. The Zero still lacked any armor protection for the pilot, still carried fuel in unprotected tanks that turned the entire aircraft into a flying torch when hit by incendiary ammunition, and most critically for what was about to happen, still lacked the speed to catch or escape from the new generation of American fighters that were now dominating Pacific skies. The A6M3 Model 22 could reach a maximum speed of 388 miles per hour at 19,690 feet. The P-38 Lightning that would attack them the next morning could achieve 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, could outdive it without any fear of structural failure, and carried enough concentrated firepower to destroy a Zero with a single accurate burst. The defensive formation these Japanese pilots would employ reflected doctrine that had been developed fighting Chinese opposition, flying obsolete aircraft back in the late 1930s. The standard defensive position placed fighters above and behind the bombers they were protecting, which made perfect sense for diving onto attackers who approached from above in the classic fighter attack profile. But this formation had a fatal blind spot that the Japanese hadn't adequately addressed. It couldn't properly protect against attackers coming from below and behind, which happened to be exactly the approach vector the Americans had planned. The Zero pilots would position themselves at approximately 6,500 feet, roughly 1,500 feet above the two Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers from the 705 Air Group. Bomber number 323 would carry Admiral Yamamoto, while bomber number 326 would carry Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki along with other staff officers. The escort pilots would scan the sky for threats they expected to come from above, diving out of the sun, using altitude advantage to build speed for slashing attacks. Death was going to approach from below, from an angle their doctrine and positioning left vulnerable. As the Japanese formation approached Bougainville at 9:30 in the morning, the 6 Zero pilots maintained their vigilant watch on the sky above and ahead. This was where every threat they had ever faced had come from. Diving out of the sun, using altitude advantage, executing the kind of attack profiles that Japanese doctrine was designed to counter. Lieutenant Morisaki, leading the escort, had positioned his two sections perfectly according to everything they had been taught, maintaining spacing that allowed mutual support while covering the largest possible area of sky. They were over the jungle of Bougainville now, with the airfield at Balalai visible in the distance, perhaps 5 minutes from landing. The most dangerous part of the journey seemed almost over, but the threat didn't come from where they were watching. At 09:34 hours, Mitchell's top cover flight spotted the Japanese formation exactly where the intelligence had predicted. 2 bombers and 6 fighters in perfect formation, completely unaware of the 16 P-38s that had been approaching from the south at treetop height for the past 2 hours. Mitchell keyed his radio for the first transmission since takeoff. Bogies, 11 o'clock high. Captain Thomas Landfear, leading the killer flight, couldn't believe their luck. The Japanese were exactly on schedule, precisely where expected, and completely oblivious to the danger climbing up from below. The P-38s jettisoned their drop tanks and began their attack climb. What happened next unfolded with such speed that participants would argue about the exact sequence of events for decades afterward. The Zero escort, scanning the sky above and the ocean horizon ahead, failed to spot the olive-drab P-38s climbing from below until they were already within gun range. The American fighters, painted in dark olive and grey, blended almost perfectly with the jungle backdrop behind them. It was a camouflage scheme developed specifically for operations in the Southwest Pacific, and it proved devastatingly effective. By the time Petty Officer Yanagiya, flying the outermost position on the right side of the formation, spotted the approaching P-38s and shouted a warning over the radio, Lieutenant Rex Barber was already within 50 yards of Yamamoto's bomber with his finger on the trigger. Barber's attack was textbook perfect in its execution. Approaching from the bomber's 7 o'clock position, below and behind, where the tail gunner couldn't depress his weapon enough to engage effectively, he opened fire with all 4 50-caliber machine guns and his single 20mm cannon. The concentrated firepower tore into the Betty's right engine, right wing root, and fuselage in a devastating stream of metal. In the after-action report Barber would file later, he described seeing the bomber's right engine begin streaming black smoke and white vapor as oil and fuel poured from ruptured lines. His shells found their mark with lethal accuracy. He continued firing as he closed the distance, shifting his aim to the left engine, seeing pieces of the aircraft's structure break away as his cannon shells impacted. The bomber was mortally wounded within seconds. Lieutenant Morisaki, leading the Zero escort from his position above and behind the bombers, saw the P-38s and instantly rolled his fighter inverted, pulling through a split-S maneuver to dive toward the attackers with his wingman following close behind. But they were starting from 1,500 feet above and behind the action, and the geometry of the situation made any effective intervention impossible. The simple physics of acceleration and distance meant that even diving at full throttle, pushing their Zeros to the structural limits, they couldn't possibly reach the Americans before fatal damage had been inflicted on Yamamoto's bomber. Chief Petty Officer Hidaka, leading the right side section, banked hard toward Barber's P-38 as soon as he saw what was happening. But the American was already pulling away from the mortally wounded bomber, using the Lightning's superior speed to escape before the Zeros could bring their weapons to bear effectively. Yamamoto's bomber, with its right engine in flames and control surfaces damaged, nosed down toward the jungle canopy below. The pilot, Warrant Officer Takeo Kotani, fought desperately to maintain some kind of control over the aircraft, but with one engine destroyed and the hydraulic systems failing, the outcome was inevitable. The Betty crashed into the jungle at 0938 hours, just 4 minutes after the first sighting of American fighters. Everyone aboard was killed instantly or died shortly after impact. The second bomber, carrying Vice Admiral Ugaki, attempted to escape toward the ocean, but Lieutenant Besby Holmes caught it and inflicted severe damage. That aircraft also crashed, though Ugaki would miraculously survive, pulled from the burning wreckage with serious injuries that would take months to heal. Of the 6 Zero pilots, only Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya managed any form of meaningful retaliation against the attacking Americans. As the P-38s disengaged and turned south toward Guadalcanal, he spotted one Lightning struggling behind the others, trailing smoke from one of its engines. This was Lieutenant Raymond Hines' aircraft, damaged either by defensive fire from the bombers or during the brief combat with the Zeros. Yanagiya pursued the wounded Lightning, closing to gun range and firing repeated bursts from his 20mm cannon. He could see strikes on the P-38's wing and fuselage, saw fuel streaming from punctured tanks, but the rugged American fighter kept flying. Its surviving engine pulled it toward home despite the damage it had absorbed. The pursuit continued for several minutes before Yanagiya had to break off. He was now far from Bougainville, low on ammunition, and other P-38s might turn back to protect their damaged comrade. He turned back toward Balalai Airfield, where the other 5 Zero pilots had already landed. Their aircraft were undamaged, but their mission had ended in catastrophic failure. Hines' P-38 never reached Guadalcanal. He disappeared over the ocean, becoming the only American loss of the entire mission. But this single victory couldn't alter the fundamental reality of what had just happened. The Imperial Japanese Navy's most important leader was dead. The failure of the Zero escort on April 18th cannot be properly understood without examining the technological mismatch that had developed by this stage of the Pacific War. The A6M0, revolutionary in 1940, was operating on borrowed time by 1943 against increasingly superior American aircraft. The Zero's lack of armor protection meant that even glancing hits could kill or incapacitate the pilot. The absence of self-sealing fuel tanks turned the aircraft into a flying incendiary device when struck by American .50 caliber incendiary rounds. Most critically for the Yamamoto mission, the Zero's maximum speed and poor high-speed handling characteristics meant it could neither catch nor escape from the new generation of American fighters. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines producing a combined 2,800 horsepower compared to the Zero's single 1,130 horsepower engine, could dictate the terms of any engagement, choosing when to attack and when to disengage entirely at will. The defensive formation employed by the Zero escort reflected tactics developed against Chinese opponents flying obsolete aircraft in the late 1930s. The positioning of fighters above and behind the bombers they protected made complete sense when the primary threat was other fighters diving from altitude to attack. This formation allowed the escorts to maintain energy advantage while keeping visual contact with the aircraft they were protecting. But by 1943, American tactics had evolved far beyond simple diving attacks. The American adoption of boom and zoom techniques, using superior speed to make single high-speed passes rather than engaging in turning dogfights, rendered traditional Japanese defensive formations obsolete. The P-38s attacking from below could use their speed advantage to strike before the Zeros could react, then escape before the Japanese fighters could bring their superior maneuverability into play. The Japanese had no effective counter to this tactic with the Zero, since the aircraft simply lacked the speed to pursue or escape from hit-and-run attacks. Perhaps the most damaging failure was the complete lack of awareness that American forces had broken Japanese naval codes. The detailed itinerary broadcast 4 days before Yamamoto's flight might as well have been sent directly to Admiral Nimitz's office. The Japanese confidence in their code security was so absolute that they never even considered the possibility that Americans might be reading their most secret communications. This overconfidence extended to every aspect of planning Yamamoto's flight. No diversionary measures were implemented, no last-minute route changes, no additional security precautions despite flying the Navy's most important leader through an active war zone just 2 days after the conclusion of Operation Wingo. The 6 Zero pilots landed at Balale Airfield in shocked silence. There was no immediate blame assigned, no accusations of cowardice or incompetence levelled at anyone. Everyone who knew what had happened understood that they had faced an ambush prepared with intelligence they couldn't possibly have anticipated, but the weight of failure was crushing nonetheless. They had been selected for the highest honour imaginable in Japanese naval aviation, protecting Admiral Yamamoto himself, and they had failed. In the rigid hierarchy of Japanese military culture, where responsibility and shame operated as collective rather than individual concepts, all 6 pilots understood that their lives were now defined by this single catastrophic failure. At Rabaul, news of Yamamoto's death spread through the naval air groups like a physical blow. The Admiral had been more than just a commander. He was the living embodiment of Japanese naval power, the one leader who truly understood both Japan's potential and its very real limitations. His death represented not just a tactical loss, but a psychological catastrophe. Morale, already battered by months of grinding attrition in the Solomons campaign, plummeted even further. The Japanese High Command immediately classified all details surrounding Yamamoto's death as top secret. When the Japanese public was finally informed on May 21st of 1943, they were told only that the Admiral had died while directing operations at the front. The true circumstances, the ambush, the code breaking, the complete failure of the escort, all of that remained hidden. On June 5th, Japan held a state funeral for Admiral Yamamoto, an honour reserved for only the nation's greatest heroes. The ceremony in Tokyo was attended by the Emperor himself, and the entire nation observed a moment of silence. For the 6 Zero pilots at Rabaul, that funeral represented a formal public acknowledgement of their failure, even if the public didn't know the details. 2 days after the funeral, on June 7th, the Japanese launched a massive air offensive against American positions in the Solomon Islands, specifically targeting the Russell Islands. The mission involved 81 Zeros, 12 of them carrying firebombs, while the rest provided escort, all from the 204th Air Group. During that June 7th raid, 2 of the Yamamoto escort pilots met their end. Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka was shot down and killed during the 90-minute battle that saw 23 to 24 Japanese aircraft lost against approximately 50 Allied fighters. Petty Officer Second Class Yasushi Okazaki also died in the same engagement. Both pilots flew Zeros armed with firebombs mounted under their wings, pressing their attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire. Their deaths marked the beginning of what would become a pattern among the surviving Yamamoto escorts, seeking some form of redemption through increasingly aggressive combat. During that same June 7th raid, Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya's war took a drastically different turn. After completing his bombing run on the Russell Islands, 2 F-4F Wildcats caught his Zero in a climbing turn. Despite desperate evasive maneuvers that pushed his aircraft to its limits, American .50 caliber rounds smashed into his cockpit with devastating effect. One bullet struck his right hand as it gripped the control stick, virtually destroying it. Only his small finger remained attached to what had been his hand. Another round tore completely through his right leg, severing major arteries and filling his flight boot with blood. Somehow, through what can only be described as extraordinary willpower, Yanagiya maintained consciousness and control of his aircraft using only his left hand. Fighting against shock and blood loss, repeatedly shouting to keep himself awake and aware, he managed to fly his crippled Zero all the way to the Japanese base at Munda. Unable to lower his landing gear with his destroyed right hand, he executed a belly landing on the coral runway. Japanese Marines pulled him from the cockpit more dead than alive, immediately amputating what remained of his right hand in a field surgery. Against all odds and medical expectations, he survived and was evacuated back to Japan. His war was over, but his life had been preserved. On June 16th, Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Morisaki, who had led the escort flight, was killed while attacking Allied transports off Lunga Point near Guadalcanal. He died alongside squadron leader Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano during another raid against American shipping. Morisaki's death, coming just 9 days after Hidaka and Okazaki were killed, left only 2 of the original 6 escorts still flying combat missions. On July 1st, Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsujinue went missing in action during an escort mission for dive bombers attacking the Allied anchorage at Rendova Island. He was never seen again, his ultimate fate unknown. Whether he was shot down over water, crashed in the jungle, or somehow survived only to die of injuries, nobody ever discovered. With Tsujinue's disappearance, only one member of the original escort remained in active combat. Petty Officer First Class Shoichi Sugita, already credited with approximately 30 victories when Yamamoto died, chose a different interpretation of redemption than his comrades. Rather than seeking immediate death in combat like the others seemed to be doing, he decided that destroying American aircraft represented better atonement for failure than a single glorious death. Throughout the summer of 1943, Sugita continued adding to his score in the skies over the Solomon Islands. By August, he had raised his tally to approximately 40 victories, becoming the leading ace in the entire Solomon Islands campaign. In August 1943, Sugita's first close call with death came when his Zero was caught by American fighters while he was attacking bombers. His aircraft took hits in the engine and caught fire. In an act that most Japanese pilots would have considered deeply shameful, Sugita bailed out of his burning fighter, parachuting down into Japanese-held territory. He survived with severe burns across much of his body. After initial treatment at a forward medical station, he was evacuated back to Japan for extended recovery, temporarily ending his combat career. By March of 1944, after 7 months of recovery and rehabilitation, Sugita returned to combat as a petty officer second class with the 263rd Air Group stationed in Guam. The Pacific War had shifted dramatically during his absence. The Americans had seized the Marshall Islands, neutralized the major Japanese base at Truk, and were clearly preparing to assault the Marianas. The strategic situation had deteriorated badly for Japan. His unit merged with the 201st Air Group in the Philippines, which was then reorganized as the first official kamikaze unit under Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi. Sugita flatly refused kamikaze missions, believing his skills were better used in conventional combat, and was ordered back to Japan. In June of 1944, Sugita participated in what the Americans would come to call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the aerial component of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19th, Japanese naval aviation launched its largest carrier operation since the Battle of Midway. The result was absolutely catastrophic for Japan. American fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day of combat. Sugita survived when his unit, the 263rd Air Group, was essentially annihilated during the battle. 6 aircraft from his unit attempted to escape to Guam after the main battle, but they were ambushed by F-6F Hellcats. 5 were shot down immediately in the ambush. Sugita's Zero was hit repeatedly, with navigation equipment destroyed and damaged throughout the airframe, but somehow he made it to a Japanese base on Rota Island as the sole survivor of his entire unit. In January of 1945, now promoted to Chief Petty Officer, Sugita joined the elite 301st Fighter Squadron of the 343rd Naval Air Group at Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu. By this time in the war, he had accumulated 70 officially credited victories, making him one of Japan's top surviving aces. On April 15, 1945, almost exactly 2 years after Yamamoto's death, American carrier aircraft launched a major attack against Kanoya. F-6F Hellcats from USS Independence and USS Randolph caught the 343rd Air Group during takeoff operations. Sugita's Kawanishi N-1K2J Shidenkai fighter was hit just as it became airborne, crashing immediately beyond the end of the runway. He died instantly at age 28, having survived longer than any other combat pilot from the Yamamoto escort mission, but never achieving the redemption he had sought through years of combat. Back in Japan, Kenji Yanagiya underwent a long and painful recovery from his June 7th wounds. The amputation of his right hand ended any possibility of returning to combat flying. Promoted to warrant officer and assigned as an instructor at Kasumigaura Naval Air Station, he spent the remainder of the war training new pilots who would fly into combat he could no longer participate in. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Yanagiya was one of approximately 5,000 surviving Japanese naval aviators from the more than 25,000 who had served during the war. After the war ended, Yanagiya returned to Tokyo and found work in a small trading company. For nearly 3 decades after the war, he told absolutely no one about his role in the Yamamoto mission. The burden of being the sole survivor of the escort remained a private shame he couldn't bring himself to share with anyone. In the mid-1970s, Japanese aviation historian Akira Yoshimura, while researching material for a book about the Yamamoto mission, discovered through his investigation that one escort pilot had survived the war. He managed to track down Yanagiya, now in his 50s and still working in Tokyo. Through multiple interviews conducted over several months, Yanagiya's story emerged for the first time in any detail. The selection process for the mission, the immense pride of being chosen, the formation over Bougainville, the devastating speed of the American attack, the impossible physics of trying to intervene. Yanagiya provided the first genuine Japanese perspective on why the mission had failed. He described in detail how the P-38s had appeared from an unexpected angle at an unexpected time, how the Zero escort had been positioned according to doctrine that proved completely inadequate, how the American fighters were faster and had executed their attack with perfect timing and precision. He emphasized repeatedly in these interviews that it had been nearly impossible to protect 2 unarmored bombers from 16 P-38s with only 6 Zero fighters, especially given the technological and tactical disadvantages they faced. On April 15th through 17th of 1988, the National Museum of the Pacific War at the Admiral Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, organized a symposium commemorating the 45th anniversary of Operation Vengeance. 8 surviving American pilots attended, and through Japanese contacts, the organizers extended an invitation to Yanagiya. He accepted, making his first trip to America at age 68. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Deseret News explicitly identify him as the lone Japanese attending the meeting, the former Zero pilot who had been there that day. During the symposium, Yanagiya met mission leader John Mitchell and presented him with a small handheld compass as a gesture of respect. He shook hands with Rex Barber and the other American pilots who had participated in the mission. An official oral history interview was recorded on April 15, 1988, now archived through the Portal to Texas History. Video documentation captured panel discussions featuring Yanagiya sitting alongside American pilots including Frank Holmes, Lewis Kittle, Jack Jacobson, Douglas Canning, and Roger Ames, discussing the mission from both perspectives. Yanagiya lived another 20 years after that symposium, occasionally giving interviews and appearing in documentaries about the Pacific War. He consistently maintained that the failure to protect Yamamoto had been essentially inevitable given the circumstances they faced: obsolescent aircraft flying against superior opposition, outdated doctrine that didn't account for American tactical evolution, and facing an enemy who knew exactly when and where to strike thanks to broken codes. On February 29, 2008, Kenji Yanagiya died at age 88, the last living witness to one of World War II's most consequential minutes of combat. The failure to protect Admiral Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, was ultimately a failure of technology and intelligence rather than one of courage or skill on the part of the escort pilots. The Zero, revolutionary in 1940, was dangerously obsolescent by 1943. Its fundamental lack of armor protection, absence of self-sealing fuel tanks, and most critically its inability to match speeds with newer American fighters made it incapable of effectively countering American boom and zoom tactics. The P-38 Lightning could engage and disengage entirely at will, dictating all the terms of combat in a way that completely negated the Zero's traditional advantages in maneuverability. The A6 M3 Model 22's maximum speed of 388 miles per hour at 19,690 feet was significantly slower than the P-38's 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The Lightning's twin Allison engines produced a combined 2,800 horsepower compared to the Zero's single 1,130 horsepower engine. The P-38 could climb 1,650 feet per minute faster than the Zero and maintained superior performance above 20,000 feet thanks to its turbo superchargers. The breaking of the JN-25D cipher code represents one of the greatest intelligence successes in the entire history of warfare. The detailed itinerary broadcast by the Japanese gave the Americans literally everything they needed for a successful interception. The message, sent to multiple commands as part of post-operation I-GO coordination efforts, specified exact times and precise locations. This intelligence coup was magnified exponentially by Japanese overconfidence in their code security and their complete failure to implement even basic operational security measures. The Japanese Navy's inability to conceive that their codes might have been compromised persisted even after Yamamoto's death became known. While some officers suspected the Americans might have been warned somehow, the Navy leadership systematically rejected any possibility that JN-25D had actually been broken. This willful blindness allowed American codebreakers to continue reading Japanese communications for many months afterward with continued success. The positioning of the escort reflected tactics that had been developed against inferior Chinese opposition back in the late 1930s. The assumption that attacks would always come from above, the spacing between aircraft that actually prevented effective mutual support, and the altitude differential that made rapid intervention physically impossible, all contributed significantly to the failure. The 6 Zero pilots were positioned in 2 V formations of 3 aircraft each at approximately 6,500 feet, 1,500 feet above and behind the 2 Betty bombers. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized individual pilot skill over coordinated tactics. While American pilots trained extensively in mutual support techniques like the Thatch weave, Japanese pilots were expected to prevail through superior individual airmanship and skill. This approach had worked reasonably well when Japanese pilots held a qualitative edge in both aircraft performance and combat experience. But by 1943, American pilots were increasingly well-trained and flying aircraft that were superior in most meaningful performance categories. For the 6 Zero pilots who flew escort on April 18, 1943, the failure defined the remainder of their lives in one way or another. Within just 3 months of that mission, 4 of them were dead. Hidaka and Okazaki were killed on June 7th, Morisaki died on June 16th, and Sujinue went missing on July 1st. Shoichi Sugita survived until April 15, 1945, accumulating 70 official victories before dying during a takeoff scramble at Kanoya when American carrier aircraft attacked the base. Only Kenji Yanagiya survived the war itself, living with the burden of that failure until 2008. The 204th Air Group, from which all 6 escorts had been drawn, suffered severe losses throughout the remainder of 1943 and into 44. The unit had been formed on November 1, 1942, through renaming of the 6th Air Group and operated from Rabaul during the Solomon Islands campaign. By the time the war ended, very few of its original pilots had survived. Yamamoto's death dealt a psychological blow to Japan, from which the nation never truly recovered during the war. He wasn't merely a fleet commander barking orders, but the intellectual architect of Japanese naval strategy itself. His deep understanding of American industrial capacity, his repeated warnings about the dangers of protracted war with America, and his ability to conceive and execute operations like Pearl Harbor made him genuinely irreplaceable. His successor, Admiral Minichi Koga, lacked both Yamamoto's strategic vision and his personal charisma. For the Americans, the successful assassination validated their intelligence capabilities in dramatic fashion and demonstrated their growing ability to execute complex, long-range operations with precision. The mission became something of a template for similar long-range fighter operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. 18 P-38s had been initially assigned to Operation Vengeance, though only 16 actually flew after 2 developed mechanical problems during the startup sequence. The failure to protect Yamamoto wasn't really a failure of the 6 individual escort pilots, as much as it was a failure of the entire Japanese military system by April of 1943. It represents the precise moment when individual courage and skill could no longer compensate for technological and intelligence disadvantages that had become overwhelming. The Zero pilots did absolutely everything their training and doctrine prescribed, executed their mission according to all established procedures, but their training and doctrine had become fatally flawed against evolved American capabilities. Could the Zero escort have saved Yamamoto if they had been positioned differently? The harsh answer based on analysis of the tactical situation is probably not. Even if they had spotted the approaching P-38s several seconds earlier, even if they had been positioned lower in the formation, the speed and firepower advantage possessed by the American fighters was simply too decisive. The P-38s needed only a few seconds to inflict mortal damage on the unarmoured Betty bombers. The Zeros might possibly have made the American attack somewhat more costly in terms of risk and exposure time, but they almost certainly couldn't have actually prevented it from succeeding. The story of why these Japanese pilots failed to protect Admiral Yamamoto is therefore not merely a tale of a single mission that went catastrophically wrong, but rather a microcosm of Japan's larger defeat in the Pacific War as a whole. It demonstrates with brutal clarity how technological superiority, intelligence advantage, and tactical innovation can completely overwhelm traditional military virtues like individual courage, exceptional skill, and personal dedication to duty. The 6 Zero pilots represented the best of Japanese naval aviation, experienced combat veterans with proven records. But by April of 1943, experience alone was no longer enough to overcome systematic disadvantages. The mission occurred at the very end of Operation Waigo, Yamamoto's last offensive effort that had claimed to sink 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 25 transports while destroying 175 Allied aircraft. Actual Allied losses were closer to about 25 aircraft and several ships damaged. The operation had involved concentrating 350 aircraft, including carrier planes stripped from the carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Junyo, and Hiyo, for strikes conducted between April 1st and 16th of 1943. Japanese losses during the operation totaled about 55 aircraft. Yamamoto had been flying to congratulate the units that participated in Operation One Go when American intelligence, having successfully broken the JN-25D code, learned the exact details of his itinerary. The precision of American planning, getting 16 P-38 fighters to navigate 420 miles in complete radio silence and arrive at exactly 9:35 hours, represents the dramatic evolution of American operational capabilities by 1943. The wreckage of Betty Bomber No. 323 still remains in the Bougainville jungle to this day, serving as a memorial to Admiral Yamamoto and his staff. The 6-0 pilots who failed to protect him are remembered primarily through Yanagiya's testimony and the few records that survived. Their failure deserves serious consideration because it encapsulates the fundamental tragedy of the Imperial Japanese Navy during the Pacific War. Skilled and dedicated warriors ultimately undone by technological inferiority, doctrinal rigidity, and catastrophic intelligence failures. Kenji Yanagiya died on February 29, 2008, at age 88, representing the last living witness to one of World War II's most consequential minutes of aerial combat. With his death, the story of the Yamamoto escort passed from living memory into pure history. But the lessons from that mission remain profoundly relevant even today. The danger of technological complacency, the critical importance of communications and intelligence security, the absolute need for military doctrine to continuously evolve with changing circumstances, and ultimately the hard limits of human courage when facing systematic disadvantages. The 6-0 pilots who flew on April 18, 1943, were not failures as individuals. They were professional military aviators asked to accomplish something that was essentially impossible given the circumstances, and their inability to achieve it marked not their personal inadequacy, but rather the beginning of the end for Imperial Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. They flew obsolescent aircraft, followed doctrine that hadn't evolved to match changing tactical realities, and faced an enemy who knew exactly when and where to strike thanks to comprehensively broken codes. Their story represents one of the Pacific War's most genuinely poignant tragedies, warriors defeated not by any lack of courage or dedication, but by the inexorably changing nature of warfare itself in an industrial age.